Now, at one level, to stand here and talk about the importance of evidence seems a bit childish. And every one of you goes through days of your lives looking at evidence, making decisions, and I'm sure every one of you recognizes that when you make your decisions based on evidence, you come out ahead. Whether it is buying groceries or getting a mortgage, buying a car or buy a house, unless you have facts or data or evidence, you're liable not to make decisions which would be as good as when you actually do have evidence. Despite the fact that it's really such a simple point, it is the case that a lot of our public policies are not based on evidence. And for my talk here today, I've picked up a topic which you, living here in the West, may find quite provocative. I'm talking about the carbon tax. The first point is that markets do not produce appropriate outcomes when you have externalities. Of course, what we mean by that is if I do something which has an effect on you and I don't take that into account, then the market doesn't work. Whether it's pollution or smoking, it doesn't really make a difference. But the problem is, anytime I have an effect on you and I don't take that into account, you need somebody to come and fix the problem. If the markets don't work, it follows that resources are going to be misallocated. Take the example of smoking. If smoking hurts others and the government doesn't do anything about it, people are going to smoke too much. Similarly, if there's some economic activity which generates pollution and someone doesn't do anything about it, there's going to be too much of that activity, and so resources are misallocated. It then follows that if we misallocate resources, our living standards are worse than they could otherwise be. And then of course it follows as well that government has a role to play to improve economic outcomes. Now this thing is being taught in universities since 1920, when Arthur Pigou looked at this issue and said, gee, there's a need to do something to make sure that our living standards are where they could be, that would exist in the absence of externalities. So that's the first point. The market would not work. The second point I want to make here is that most externality situations, not all, but most externality situations, putting a tax on what produces externalities is the optimal solution to the problem. Given that theory, the question arises, is there evidence to back up what I've just told you? And I've talked about this issue in the context of a carbon tax and the emission of greenhouse gases. But the issue is much broader than a carbon tax. We can talk about environmental taxes in general. There is, as I'm sure you are all aware, a debate going on the carbon tax for quite a long time. A political party made it into an election platform and got beaten up pretty bad. If you talk to people, you'll hear a wide range of views, often conflicting on whether or not carbon tax is a good thing. There are lots of people, especially a lot of people living in Calgary, who would say it is going to hurt the economy. At a personal level, and that really is a distributional issue, there's a lot of concern that if you put a carbon tax, that's going to drive up the price of gas and other things, and of course it's going to have an effect on my real incomes, and that isn't a good thing for a lot of people. There are other views which basically say we are willing to pay a price, an economic price, because we have an obligation to the environment, and we must make sure that we pass on to our children that environment which we got from our parents and grandparents. Now, in contrast to this view where someone says, I am willing to pay a price, there are others who say, why would there be a price? If your economics tells you that you must do something to control carbon or pollution in general, it's good for the economy, and if you are also worried about the environment, it's good for the environment. So where is the trade-off? Why can't we have a win-win outcome? So there are all these, as I said, conflicting views, and let me say that every one of these views could be right. And why could every one of these conflicting views be right? Well, simply because the impact of a carbon tax or the impact of an environmental tax really depends on how you design it. If you design a bad carbon tax or you design a bad environment tax, it's going to be bad for the economy. If you design a good tax, it will be good for the economy. My read of the debate in Canada is, I haven't heard anyone talk about the design of an appropriate carbon tax. People have talked about it, they've talked about whether or not there should be a carbon tax, they've talked about revenue neutrality, but the design of a carbon tax goes much deeper than that. So depending on what it is, you can have all kinds of outcomes. However, as I said, economic theory makes it quite clear that if you do your policy right, you should be able to get an improvement in the economy. And of course, it's a given that if you take an action on this front, it should be good for the environment as well. So there's no reason on earth why you cannot achieve both your objectives if you do your policy properly. I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of this issue. What I want to really share with you is an examination of a number of countries which have relied on environmental taxes quite heavily, and just see what they have done and whether or not their experience would tell me something, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So that's what I want to share with you. So here's my first of a number of charts. So what I've done here is picked up countries which have relied on environmental taxes quite a lot. And I've 4 countries in that group: Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway. I have put in as well the average for the 40 odd OECD countries. And of course I have Canada and the US in the back as well. So what this chart tells you is the share of environmental taxes in these 7 jurisdictions to GDP. So it's basically a tax to GDP ratio for 2008, which is the last year for which I could find internationally comparable data from the OECD. So when you look at this chart, you find that Denmark has a tax on environmental issues, which is about 4% of GDP. Netherlands is pretty close, and then we have Sweden, Norway. The OECD average is about 1.75% of GDP. Canada is about 1%, slightly above 1, and the US is slightly below 1. So we are the 2 laggards, in that group of countries which rely quite heavily on environmental taxes as a share of GDP. Now, it isn't necessarily the case that when you have high environmental taxes, that means high taxes. Environmental taxes are a source of revenue which can be used to reduce other taxes. So the overall tax burden should not bear any relationship to what environmental taxes are as a proportion of GDP. A second way of looking at the same thing is to look at environmental taxes as a share of total taxes. So instead of taxes as a proportion of GDP, which is the overall tax burden, this is the emphasis on taxes on environmental topics as a share of total taxes. The point I was making that if you have high environmental taxes, that doesn't mean that your overall tax burden has to go up. So here what you find is that a couple of countries, Netherlands, Denmark, they have pretty high shares of overall taxes as environmental taxes. We have OECD there as well, Norway and Sweden, and the same ranking for Canada and the US. We are the 2 bottom countries in this group of 7. What you would expect from this system of taxation is that in our production, we'll be using a lot more energy than countries which have high environmental taxes. This is exactly what you see. In our production processes, we rely the most on the use of energy, followed by the US. And of course, all those countries which have high taxes, they don't rely on energy to produce the goods and services that they do. The same thing you should see on the consumption side. So here is the consumption of total materials in these countries. The year here is 2005 because I don't have more recent data on that. Just like production, Canada is the #1 in the use of materials for consumption, followed by the US, and then of course we have the other 5. This is exactly what economics will tell you. If the price is high, you're going to use less of it. And this should follow as well. This is the change in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2012. At the very extreme on the left side is Denmark, which has a reduction in GHGs of about 17% over this period. Sweden is next, Netherlands. There's a small increase over this 20+ year period in the OECD and Norway. The US has an increase as well, but look where Canada is. We are in a league of our own compared to other countries. So far what we have seen is what you would expect from simple supply-demand diagrams. You have high taxes in some countries. They don't use energy to the same extent in production. They don't use energy to the same, or materials to the same extent in consumption. And of course, they have been able to control their greenhouse gases. This is the environmental picture. Now we go to the economy. Have these high environmental taxes hurt these countries? And the indicator I use here is productivity growth. Productivity growth to me is the most important economic indicator anybody can think of. In effect, Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics some years ago, said, productivity isn't everything, but it is almost everything. And so you cannot ever imagine to have an increase in your real wages or incomes over time if productivity growth does not exist. And in that area, productivity growth, Canada is in pretty bad shape. Even the US, which you found to be a back-end player on environmental issues, on productivity growth is way ahead of Canada. And then, of course, countries that you saw were doing quite well on the environmental front are way ahead on the productivity front as well. So it seems that high environmental taxes don't really have a negative impact on productivity growth. So Sweden and Norway are at the top. Next I have per capita GDP. So you take all your production divided by the number of people. That is your living standard, measured very simply in economic terms. Canada is in the middle of the pack. So the fact that we are at the bottom on environmental issues doesn't take us to the top on the economic stuff. Again, countries, a country which has high environmental taxes, Norway is at the top, US is second. And given a variety of things that are going well for Canada, we are in the middle of this pack. Social issues. And again, I've picked up here an indicator which I think of all of the social indicators, this is probably the one which captures the most important information. This is the distribution of income across your population, and you must have heard about income inequality, poverty, and all those kinds of discussions going on. And the basis for all of that, of course, is income distribution. I have this thing called Gini coefficient. All you need to know on this is that the bigger the number, the more unequal is the distribution of income. The more people are going to be in the poverty group if Gini is high. At the other extreme, if Gini is 0, it means everybody has exactly the same level of income. So the higher the number, the more unequal the distribution of income. So on the social side, you will see that Canada is second in terms of unequal distribution of income, and countries which have done well on the environment, on the economy, do well as well on income distribution issues. So Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Netherlands are doing better than anybody else. So I have covered so far the environmental side, the economic side, the social side, and I've given you a lot of indicators. You won't find any country which is doing the best in all categories. So the question really arises, how do you aggregate all of this? And I've found a way to do that. We can talk about this later if you want to. But I'll show you a chart which combines the economic, social, and environmental performance into one summary indicator. I'll show you that. So that's how it looks. The indicators I've showed you, this is an aggregation of those indicators. So this is your overall performance. Denmark and Norway are at the top with a score of 9 out of 10. Netherlands, Sweden follow. The OECD average is next. The US is 6th in my group of 7, and Canada is really at the bottom. Now when I look at this chart, of course this is a chart over the last 15, 20 years, depending on what data I'm looking at. So this is somewhat longer term performance than what happened last quarter or what is happening what has happened over the last year. But I still find this somewhat disturbing that a newspaper like the Globe and Mail would actually write an editorial, which they did about 2 weeks ago, saying, relatively speaking to the rest of the world, we are really doing quite well. In absolute terms, we can do somewhat better. And when I look at my charts and say, what information are they looking at that I'm totally unaware of? And I can only speculate that what they're doing is looking at us compared to the US. I thought only the Americans thought they are the world, but I think Globe and Mail thinks they are the world as well. And if you compare ourselves with the US, we are of course not as good as the US on productivity growth. We are not as good as the US on average incomes. They are slightly ahead of us on the environment front. They are somewhat behind us on income distribution issues. But there's one area where we have done really well compared to the US, not only actually against the US, but compared to every other country, and that is in controlling our budget deficits. Now I, as a macroeconomist, having spent 25 years at the Department of Finance, totally understand the importance of budget deficits. I completely agree that we should not have a budget deficit on an ongoing basis. But it's a policy instrument, it's not an outcome. So if you control budget deficits and nothing comes out of it in terms of economic performance, you're doing something wrong. And that is my issue, that there are a lot of people who just focus on the budget deficit number and say, gee, we are doing really well, without asking the question, if you're doing really well on this front, where is the impact on your outcomes? That I don't see. So that is what I think is happening, that people looking at our fiscal situation say, we're doing wonders. Yes, we are, but we need to do better on other aspects as well. So, what does this evidence tell us about environmental taxes? I would argue that you cannot draw a strong conclusion from what I showed you. I showed you association, not causation. And as an economist, I should warn you that we cannot draw the conclusion that if you put environmental taxes, they would improve your environmental outcomes, economic outcomes, and social outcomes. We cannot say that. At the same time, I would argue that we cannot reject a weaker conclusion. And that conclusion is that there's no reason why we cannot do well if we were to follow appropriate policies and use environmental taxes at the same time. So that conclusion you saw with evidence, you cannot reject. So my conclusion on what I've just told you is that we need to get serious about this. not because I've become an environmentalist. I don't know what an environmentalist is. I don't understand much about the environment. I look at it purely from an economic perspective, and I would argue, following Economics 101, that if there are externalities, we need to follow appropriate policies to deal with those externalities. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we can actually do well if we do that. So evidence is the bottom line. Economic theory has been there for a long time, and let's pay some attention to how we can actually design appropriate tax policies. So now that I've come to the conclusion of my points on the carbon tax or taxes on the environment, let's talk a bit about the long-form census. So what have we done with evidence in cancelling that? And I'm sure you would have expected me to say a few words about the long-form census, given where I come from. Okay, so what is the assessment of the National Household Survey? First is the question of data quality. The response rate, as some of you may know, for the National Household Survey was 68.6%. The global non-response rate, now this is somewhat different from the regular response rate, which is how many of us actually completed the form. This is a combination of the response rate by the population, or the geographic response rate, plus what Statistics Canada calls the item response rate. So it adds as well the information from which questions got answered and which ones were not. So it's a combination of two things. So according to Statistics Canada's numbers, the global non-response rate for the National Household Survey on average for the entire population was 26.1%. Now the census cutoff for producing, publishing, disseminating information is 25%. If Statistics Canada had followed the same standards in data dissemination as the long-form census, on average, there would be no information released for the National Household Survey. Nothing would have been published because the cutoff rate is 25%. So how come StatCan has published these numbers? Well, they published these numbers because the cutoff for the census, the 25% for the global non-response rate, was raised from 25 to 50%. And that is what allowed StatCan to publish the information in the National Household Survey. Despite the fact that the cutoff rate was raised from 25 to 50, we only still have 75% of the 4,567 census subdivision information. 25% of those census subdivisions do not have any information because the global non-response was even higher than 50%. For Saskatchewan, which is at the bottom of the heap, only 57% of subdivisions have found their data published by StatCan because the quality of data for the rest, which is a pretty large number of 43%, isn't good enough. Another indicator that StatCan is quite concerned about the quality of this information is that they have not provided historically linked data for the simple reason that the methodology for the NHS is quite different from the long-form census of the past. So the data are not comparable. You cannot really put them together and do time series analysis. You can do that at your own risk. StatCan isn't willing to give you the commitment that you're doing the right thing. So that's the data quality issue. This thing shocks quite a lot of people that you can get a voluntary survey instead of a census and your cost actually goes up. I've been asked that question so many times. How can the cost go up if it's a voluntary survey? Well, the cost went up because if people are not responding to your survey, you have to do a follow-up. And follow-up doesn't cost money. The sample size was increased. Instead of 1 in 5 for the long form census, the sample size was 1 in 3. And of course, given the voluntary nature of the survey, there were many more challenges with the data, and StatCan, of course, has to spend resources to try to fix those problems. So all of these things cost more money, and the cost of the NHS was $652 million, of which $22 million was the extra cost for the simple fact that it was a survey, not a census. So what do people think about what I've just told you? If you have followed the analysis of the NHS, the media, and I've just picked up these words from one article in the Globe and Mail written by Tabia Grant. A lot of people call this data garbage. Some said it is dangerous to use this, and others have called these data to be totally useless. So we now have higher cost and lower quality, and the question arises, why did all of this happen? If you ask me, I would answer, I just don't know. In fact, I don't know, although it has been said publicly by some that privacy was the issue. I've written an article for a book on the importance of food data, and you'll find a lot of questions in that article where I make the argument that I simply cannot understand how privacy can be an issue driving this. And the question that arises, this trade-off of achieving more privacy at the cost of more expense, and the quality of data, which is such that if we had applied the census standards, we probably wouldn't have seen any information from the NHS. And my answer to this question is no, it isn't worth it. Had I been given a chance, I would basically have cancelled the census and not replaced it with a survey, rather than spend more money and have a survey done, which doesn't really provide very useful data. Okay. I wrote an article in the Globe and Mail recently where I took the debate a little further than we got bad data. Of course we got bad data. We understand that. But in my mind, bad data is one of 3 problems, and the least of the 3 problems. I have 2 bigger issues than bad data. My first issue is that census is an anchor to test the quality of other surveys, and we've lost that anchor. And my biggest issue is that trust in statistics scandal independence has been affected by the decision of the long form census. I think of the census as an anchor like a doctor in the community. So you have a community, people get sick, they go to the doctor tells them what's wrong with them, gives them the medication, fixes them up. The same thing happens with the census. StatCan does a lot of voluntary surveys, a lot. They look at those data, they find problems, they take it to the census, confront the census information with these surveys, they find out what the problem is with these surveys, they fix them up. And that's how you get your information. Now we don't have a doctor. And so what we do is, a patient goes to another patient and says, I'm sick, you are sick as well. What have you been doing to fix yourself up? Tell me, and so I'll start doing the same thing. So it's basically a group of sick people advising each other. So it's a group of voluntary surveys advising each other without there being any basis as to whether or not those surveys reflect the reality in the community in the first place. And of course, over time, as that anchor, becomes older and older, we now have the 2006 census as an anchor. It isn't obviously relevant for 2013. It will be even less relevant for 2016. But that's the only thing we've got to adjust our voluntary surveys. And the term I used in one of my previous book articles is that over time, garbage would guide garbage. That's basically what we're going to end up with. And so the quality of other surveys from StatCan, the voluntary surveys, is going to keep diminishing over time, and you would have no way of knowing in the future as to how bad they are compared to the reality that exists in the Canadian society. Finally, the third main issue for me, data production is a pretty complex exercise. I have used data all my life, and I've run StatCan for some time as well. If somebody tells me, here is data coming out of StatCan, what do you think about it? I won't have a clue, because it's a fairly complex issue. The only reason I use data from StatCan is because I trust the organization. I know they're quite good people, and they must have done everything that is humanly possible to make sure data is of good quality. But something funny is going on these days, and I've experienced that myself. Todd Hirsch wrote an article in the Globe and Mail and explained his experience. You go and tell somebody, well, this is what the data shows, and the reaction from the people you're talking to, but these data have been fixed by the government. And you tell them, no, they haven't been fixed by the government. StatCan is an independent agency, and the response is, you are telling me that after what happened with the long form census. So the trust in the agency has begun to diminish, and once that happens, it doesn't really matter whether the data are good or bad. People will not ever be comfortable that they can trust it. So given these other issues, what is it that should get done? And my idea is that StatCan should become like the Canada Revenue Agency. The Canada Revenue Agency is an arm's length organization. It has a commissioner who is like a deputy minister, like the chief statistician. But the minister doesn't really have any role. The minister's only job is to report the activities of StatCan to Parliament. Cannot interfere in the affairs of Revenue Canada, which is, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, is really important. There are other agencies that the Government of Canada has which are independent from the government. The best example is the Bank of Canada. So if you think it really is important for the government to keep its hands off from issues like the determination of interest rates, the exchange rate, the tax, why is statistics collection any different from these things? I would argue that the independence of Statistics Canada, the trust in your statistics is really as important as the collection of your taxes and the setting up of your interest rates. So I have been pushing for anyone who would listen to me that we should change the Statistics Act, and instead of the minister having the authority to make decisions on technical issues and statistical issues, which in my mind would include what questions should get asked in the census, that all of those responsibilities should be given to the chief statistician, and the minister should basically do what the Minister of National Revenue does and make sure that Statistics Canada is accountable to Canadians through their parliament. So this is something which I emphasize these days, and this is what I'm sharing with you, that's what I think should happen in the future. Hopefully someone will take this on. Thank you.